There are moments in history when a single human being armed with nothing more than courage, skill, and a belief that something better can always be built, changes the course of events for everyone around him. Before we dive into the battlefield where such a moment unfolded, let me invite you just once to subscribe so you can continue walking with us through these forgotten chapters of human grit and ingenuity. Now let us step into the black volcanic ash of a small island in the Pacific, where a quiet toolmaker from Ohio would redefine what one person could do when the world around him seemed to be collapsing. The dawn of February 19, 1945 broke over Iwo Jima like a grim omen. Black sand stretched across the shoreline like a scar absorbing the first sunlight in a dull, lifeless glow. At exactly 900 hours, Corporal Tony Stein crouched inside a shallow depression carved into that same sand, while enemy bullets cracked so close to his skull that he could feel the air tearing apart. Only 23 years old, with 6 combat missions behind him, he found himself fighting across an island barely 8 square miles in total area. Underneath that island wound more than 11 miles of Japanese tunnels dug by 17,000 defenders who had spent months preparing to transform every meter of ground into a trap. The landing zone was not a battlefield. It was a slaughterhouse. The overlapping fields of fire, the expertly camouflaged pillboxes, the mortar teams hidden deep inside reinforced bunkers, everything worked together with terrifying precision. The 5th Marine Division had already lost more than 40 men by mid-morning, and the bodies of Marines lay twisted in the volcanic ash, their silhouettes dark against the unnatural blackness of the beach. Around Stein, members of Company A of the 28th Marines hugged the ground, unable to lift their heads long enough to even identify where the fire was coming from. Yet in the middle of that chaos, Stein held something strange, something that looked more like a laboratory experiment than a battlefield weapon. It was a machine gun that officially did not exist. Months earlier, a skeptical sergeant had examined the weapon and dismissed it as a foolish idea that would fail at the first hint of real combat. Other Marines had laughed when they saw the thin aircraft barrel, the improvised solenoid trigger, and the hybrid body assembled from salvaged parts. But Stein had always seen the world differently. Where others saw a problem, he saw a mechanism waiting for the right hands to reshape it. His hands had been shaping tools long before he ever set foot on Iwo Jima. Born in Dayton, Ohio, to Austrian Jewish immigrants who had fled ruthless persecution in Eastern Europe, Stein grew up surrounded by machines. As a teenager, he learned to cut metal on a lathe at Patterson Field, reading the vibrations of the machine the way musicians read the subtle tremors of a string. Later, he worked as a tool and die maker at Dello Products, working with the kind of precision that makes the difference between a reliable mechanism and a catastrophic jam. He understood the logic of steel. He understood the behavior of moving parts the same way a farmer understands weather or a physician understands a heartbeat. So when he joined the Para-Marines in September of 1942 and deployed to Bougainville, he brought that mechanical intuition with him. On one memorable day, he shot 5 Japanese snipers, but it was not his shooting that impressed Sergeant Mel Grevich. It was his ability to modify equipment to smooth a trigger pull, to rework a faulty mechanism, to transform a standard issue tool into something that gave Marines a fighting chance. Grevich, an inventive Marine in his own right, recognized the spark immediately. During the Bougainville campaign, Grevich had already begun experimenting with something unusual. A salvaged AN-M2 aircraft machine gun pulled from the wreckage of a Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The gun was originally meant for aerial dogfights, firing into the slipstream of a plane at hundreds of miles per hour. It weighed only about 21 pounds, making it lighter than the Browning M1919 that Marines relied on for ground combat. But what made the AN-M2 extraordinary was its rate of fire, somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds per minute. It was a thunderclap compared to the steady drumbeat of the infantry machine guns, yet it was completely unsuitable for infantry use. It had no stock, no shoulder support, no infantry sights, and no way for a lone Marine to carry it effectively. The spade grips were designed for mounting onto aircraft. It was in essence a raw idea that needed a toolmaker to breathe life into it. After the Para-Marines were disbanded, both Stein and Grevich were reassigned to the 28th Marines, where they prepared for an operation that nobody would name aloud but everybody understood would be devastating. It was here in the quiet hours inside a maintenance shed in Hawaii that Grevich handed Stein the salvaged aircraft gun, and Stein immediately saw the blueprint of what it could become. Night after night, with nothing more than basic tools, and the stubborn belief that Marines deserved a weapon that could match the ferocity of the enemy's fortifications, Stein reshaped metal the way a sculptor reshapes clay. He cut down an M1 Garand stock, hollowed it out to fit the buffer tube of the AN-M2, fabricated a solenoid trigger from scrap sheet metal, and worked with Grevich to attach a Browning automatic rifle bipod and compatible sights. They created a weapon that weighed 25 pounds, fed from 100-round ammunition boxes, and could empty a box in about 5 seconds. It was crude, it was ugly, but it was alive. They named it the Stinger. Even before Iwo Jima, the Stinger drew mixed reactions. Some Marines looked at it and saw pure innovation. Others saw a suicide weapon. But when Stein took the completed gun onto a range and reduced a target at 200 yards into splinters in barely 6 seconds, the doubts evaporated. The Stinger was approved for combat. And now, on the beach of Iwo Jima, surrounded by death and chaos, Stein held that same weapon. A weapon that could alter the fate of the men around him if he could survive long enough to use it. But survival was an equation that Stein understood better than most, and the next chapter of that equation was about to begin. Stein tightened his grip on the Stinger, feeling the metal vibrate faintly beneath his palms as the heat from earlier test bursts radiated through the improvised stock. Around him, Marines lay pinned by fire from pillboxes. They could not even see hidden apertures carved into volcanic rock expertly camouflaged with sand and stone. Standard procedure called for tanks or naval bombardment to neutralize those positions, but the tanks were hopelessly bogged down in the soft ash, and naval gunners could not target what their observers could not find. The battlefield demanded a new kind of solution. Stein, thinking as mechanically as he always did, treated the impossible situation like a problem waiting to be solved. If the Marines could not see the pillboxes, they could not shoot them. If they could not shoot them, they could not advance. So Stein did something none of the manuals recommended. He stood up. He rose straight into the fury of the Japanese guns, exposing himself fully above the sand while bullets hissed past his chest and shoulders like angry hornets. He needed the enemy to fire at him. He needed the muzzle flashes. Only then could he aim the Stinger and begin dismantling the deadly architecture of the beach. For a few tense seconds he saw nothing, only the blur of volcanic dust kicked up by bullets striking the ground. Then an eruption of flame flashed from a slab of rock 75 yards to the northwest. A pillbox perfectly hidden under the ash. Stein pivoted smoothly, lowered the Stinger and squeezed the solenoid trigger. The weapon roared. The sound was not the chopping bark of a normal machine gun. It was a sustained scream of metal and fire, a stream of 1,200 rounds per minute tearing into the disguised opening. Sandbags evaporated into clouds of dust. The volcanic rock shattered. The Type 92 heavy machine gun inside fell silent within seconds. Stein did not wait. He scanned the terrain. Another flicker, this one, 40 yards to the left. The Stinger roared again, a 5-second burst, unleashing enough bullets to crack open the concrete shell of the second pillbox and suffocate the defenders inside. As the dust settled, Marines behind him lifted their heads in disbelief. Positions that had pinned them for hours were suddenly silent. The battlefield shifted. Riflemen rose from their shallow depressions called shell scrapes by the Marines and began to advance. Sergeants shouted new orders. The stalled assault, frozen in place since the first waves landed, was finally moving again. Stein sprinted toward the nearest pillbox, the Stinger held like a rifle despite its weight. Inside, he found 3 Japanese soldiers dead, their bodies collapsed in the corners where the torrent of bullets had cut them down. In the second pillbox, 2 more lay motionless. But before he could savor the progress, Stein felt a sudden lightness in the weapon. The Stinger had run dry. The entire 100-round ammunition box had lasted barely 10 seconds of real firing time. Stein had known this would happen. He had calculated it in Hawaii, testing the Stinger on the range, but understanding something in theory was different from experiencing it in the middle of a battlefield. The Stinger was powerful. It could shatter defenses in seconds. But to keep it alive, Stein needed ammunition, and the ammunition resupply point sat 200 yards back at the waterline. 200 yards of open volcanic ash, 200 yards under mortar fire, 200 yards across a beach where every other Marine who tried to stand had been cut down. Stein began to run. The volcanic ash swallowed his boots with every step rolling underfoot like millions of tiny glass marbles. Each stride sank several inches into the unstable terrain. Marines later described running through that ash as moving across ball bearings. Stein gritted his teeth, forcing his muscles to maintain momentum even as his legs burned. Halfway back to the beach, he saw a wounded Marine, a private first class from 2nd Platoon, lying in the ash bleeding heavily from a shrapnel wound to his left leg. The man was conscious, but barely. He could not walk. Stein did not hesitate. He hauled the wounded Marine over his shoulder, adding another 160 pounds to his burden. Combined with his 25-pound Stinger and his 30-pound combat pack, Stein was now carrying more than 215 pounds across a lethal stretch of open ground. Japanese mortars bracketed the beach, bursting in thunderous plumes of ash and steel fragments. Snipers watched the shoreline, searching for movement. But Stein ran, driven not by fear but by the raw logic of survival. He reached the waterline at 9:45. The corpsman took the wounded Marine. Stein grabbed 4 boxes of linked .30 caliber ammunition, each weighing several pounds, stuffed 2 into his pack, carried the other 2 in his hands, and turned to sprint back toward Company A. He did not stop. Bullets kicked up spurts of black ash around him. A mortar round exploded 30 yards to his right, showering him with volcanic fragments. Yet Stein pressed forward, fueled by urgency and the awareness that every second he moved faster meant another Marine might live. When he reached his platoon again, his sergeant immediately pointed out a 3rd pillbox, a larger reinforced concrete bunker overlooking the approach toward the airfield. 4 Marines already lay dead in front of it. 2 previous assaults had failed. The defenders inside were confident. They had stopped every attempt so far. Stein reloaded the Stinger. Then he stood up and walked straight toward the pillbox. The Type 96 light machine gun inside opened fire instantly. Bullets ripped past Stein's face, tore the air beside his ribs, and snapped across the ash. He kept walking one deliberate step after another until he reached 50 yards. Then he fired. The Stinger's rate of fire was so overwhelming that the Japanese gunners could not adjust their aim before the fury of bullets punched through the firing slit. Stein closed the final 20 yards, tossed a grenade through the opening, and eliminated the entire 3-man crew inside. But again, the Stinger was empty. 100 rounds gone, 10 seconds of fire. Stein now understood the true nature of the weapon he had built. The Stinger was like a lightning strike, devastating, unstoppable, but requiring constant replenishment. It could clear a pillbox in a heartbeat. It could restore momentum to a stalled assault. But it was always hungry. And as long as Company A needed it, Stein would have to keep feeding it. The next run back to the beach was already waiting for him, and with it, the next impossible decision, the next wounded Marine he would carry, and the next test of how far one man could push himself before his body began to fail. He tightened the straps of his pack and began running again. Stein's second run to the beach began with the same relentless urgency as the first. The volcanic ash shifted beneath his boots, swallowing each step, gripping his ankles as if the island itself wanted to hold him in place. The Stinger was empty. The Marines were moving again only because he had shattered the first line of pillboxes, and if he did not keep returning with ammunition, that momentum would die just as quickly as it had ignited. But halfway down the slope, he encountered 2 more wounded Marines. One had a sucking chest wound each breath, producing a wet rattling sound as air leaked through torn flesh. The other had lost part of his right hand to shrapnel, the blood matting against the black sand. Stein could not carry both at once. Even his remarkable strength had limits. But he could make choices. He took the chest wound case first, heaving the man over his shoulder and tearing through the ash toward the waterline again. Every step jarred the Marine's broken ribs, but every step also brought him closer to the corpsman. Stein made it. Then, without resting, without pausing for a sip of water or a breath of relief, he turned around and sprinted back up toward the second wounded Marine. Only after both men were safely delivered to the corpsman did he begin stuffing more ammunition into his pack. By 10:30, Stein had already made 4 full trips between the front line and the beach, 4 times through the killing ground. 4 round trips carrying wounded Marines to safety, 4 round trips returning with ammunition for the Stinger. His platoon had advanced nearly 200 yards because of the firepower he provided. But the cost was becoming obvious, not just in ammunition but in physical strain. The Stinger itself was beginning to suffer. The thin aircraft barrel, designed to be cooled by 200 to 300 mile-per-hour slipstreams in open-air combat, was now glowing a faint red from sustained firing without airflow. The solenoid trigger cut from scrap metal in a Hawaiian workshop began sticking. Sometimes it snapped perfectly. Sometimes it clung stubbornly, forcing Stein to tap it with his palm to reset it. His boots, hammered repeatedly against the volcanic grit, were wearing away. The soles were nearly gone. The leather had cracked. During one brief pause, Stein looked down and saw the damage clearly. The boots that had protected him for months were now little more than tattered shells. Every step sent a sharp pain radiating through his arches. He could feel the ash grinding between the torn leather and his skin like powdered glass. He made a decision that seemed irrational to anyone watching. He unlaced the boots and kicked them off. He would run barefoot. The idea sat at the edge of madness, but Stein understood the mathematics instantly. Every second counted. Every pound of gear mattered. His boots were slowing him down. The ash was abrasive but not unbearably hot in shaded areas. Barefoot, he could feel the ground directly and adjust his stride. And if shedding his boots saved a single Marine's life, then the pain was simply another variable in the equation. He also removed his helmet. The M1 steel pot weighed over 2 pounds. Combined with the weight of the boots, he had shed nearly 5 pounds of gear, translating directly into increased speed across the treacherous beach. His fifth run was faster. Barefoot Stein could dig his toes directly into the ash, gaining traction the boots had denied him. It was painful, unmistakably painful, but pain was irrelevant. He had moved beyond the realm of comfort, beyond the sphere of hesitation. He was solving a battlefield problem in the only way the battlefield allowed. Halfway down he spotted another wounded Marine, this one struck in the abdomen by shrapnel. The man was unconscious. Stein lifted him in a single fluid motion and carried him toward the waterline. Corpsmen worked frantically, dragging the casualty into a sheltered position, and Stein immediately seized another load of ammunition and began sprinting back. By 1100 hours, Corporal Tony Stein had made 6 full trips from the front to the beach. He had carried 6 wounded Marines to safety. He had hauled more than 600 rounds of ammunition back to his platoon, and he had personally knocked out multiple Japanese positions with the Stinger. His platoon had advanced 300 yards inland, remarkable progress in terrain engineered to kill advancing infantry. But the Japanese were not merely defending fixed bunkers. Their defensive system was far more intricate. Beneath the volcanic crust lay a labyrinth of spider holes, trenches, and interconnecting tunnels. When one position fell, Japanese soldiers emerged from another to resume fire. It was a defense built not just with concrete but with intelligence, persistence, and the willingness to fight to the last breath. The Stinger was the only weapon in Company A capable of matching that complexity with overwhelming fire. Its sheer rate of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute, delivered not only the physical suppression needed to silence a pillbox, but also the psychological shock that forced nearby Japanese soldiers to duck, hesitate, or freeze, buying crucial seconds for riflemen to move in with grenades. But every burst of fire drove the improvised machine gun closer to failure. By 11:20, the barrel glowed visibly. The heat shimmered around it, turning the air above into a wavering column of distortion. The solenoid trigger was degrading with each burst. Stein was fighting not only enemy soldiers but the mechanical limits of a weapon never meant for ground combat. Then came the bunker. It was larger than the others. Reinforced concrete, 3 firing slits, multiple Type 96 machine guns, sweeping the battlefield with interlocking bands of fire. 2 tank destroyers had already tried to eliminate it but had been driven off when concealed 47mm anti-tank guns opened fire. An airstrike had been called in, but the bombs missed by 50 yards. The position remained intact, its gun crews emboldened. Stein studied the slits, 8 inches wide, 4 inches tall, small targets hard to hit. But with 1,200 rounds per minute, precision ceased to matter. Statistics mattered, volume mattered. If he aimed directly at the slit and held the trigger long enough, some rounds would find their way inside. He crawled forward, then dropped prone at 50 yards. He opened fire. The Stinger's 100-round box emptied in 7 seconds. Stein saw rounds tear through the darkness of the firing slit. The Japanese machine guns inside fell silent almost instantly. Without waiting, Stein sprinted forward, dropped grenades through the slits and obliterated the 5-man crew inside. Company A surged forward again. Stein made his 7th run to the beach at 11:50, carrying a Marine who had lost both legs below the knee to a mine. The man screamed with every jolt as Stein ran the blood soaking through Stein's uniform. A corpsman later admitted that if Stein had been 30 seconds slower, the Marine would have died. On his way back up, Stein encountered another Marine carrying a Stinger, or rather what had once been a Stinger. This one had overheated so badly that its barrel had warped beyond use. The gun was dead. Another reminder that Stein's improvised weapon, no matter how ingenious, had limits. But Stein was not thinking about mechanical grief or battlefield engineering. To him, everything reduced to numbers: the number of men he could save, the number of rounds he could deliver, the number of seconds he could shave from each run. Some Marines watching him now thought he was insane. Others thought he was the bravest man on the island. Stein himself thought neither. He simply thought the arithmetic was working. But the battlefield was not finished testing his calculations. A new threat was watching him high on the ridgeline, preparing to send a single lethal reminder that one man, no matter how determined, was never beyond danger. And the next challenge would force Stein to confront a sniper who knew exactly what he was doing. By the time Stein began his 8th run toward the beach, even the other Marines, battle-hardened men who had seen the worst the Pacific could offer, had begun glancing at him with expressions that hovered somewhere between awe and disbelief. A barefoot Marine sprinting across open ground carrying ammunition boxes in both hands, his uniform smeared with the blood of the wounded he had hauled, was not something one saw every day. Yet Stein moved with the same urgency as his first run, driven not by adrenaline, but by the quiet mathematics that guided every decision he made. But the battlefield had changed. Japanese snipers, trained to detect patterns and exploit them, had started paying attention to one specific figure who kept racing across the same deadly path. They had watched him rescue Marine after Marine. They had watched him repair the momentum of an entire company almost single-handedly. And now, as Stein headed back up from the beach, 4 ammunition boxes bouncing in his Pac-1 sniper, decided it was time to end the barefoot corporal's improbable run. The first shot came so close that Stein felt it brush the air past his cheek. It was a clean, professional shot, precisely the kind fired by a soldier who had been waiting patiently for a high-value target to enter his scope. Stein dropped instantly into the volcanic ash, his body pressing flat against the gritty ground. The Stinger slammed into the ash beside him. The sniper was good. Stein did not know exactly where he was, but the angle of the shot revealed the direction somewhere along the ridgeline, about 200 yards to the east. The terrain around Stein offered no meaningful cover, no dips or rocks large enough to shield him. The ash was so flat that even the slightest motion risked giving the sniper a new opportunity. A second shot cracked overhead, then a third, both hitting the place Stein had been lying moments before. The shooter had not fully acquired Stein's location yet. That gave Stein seconds, no more. He calculated the options. Running away meant moving directly along the sniper's line of fire. The sniper would adjust and fire into his back. Staying prone meant waiting for death. Staying still was not survival, it was surrender. Running perpendicular to the sniper's aim reduced the probability of being hit. Moving toward the sniper reduced it even more because the sniper would need to adjust elevation, wind, and angle rapidly, all while Stein was closing distance with a weapon that could turn rock into dust. In less than a heartbeat, Stein decided. He rolled, left, seized the Stinger, and sprinted toward the sniper. 3 more shots sliced past him, each missing by inches. Barefoot, his feet tearing against the coarse volcanic ash, Stein pushed himself into a full sprint. The ammunition boxes rattled inside his pack, and every jolt sent a shock through wounds he had accumulated over the past hours. He ignored all of it. He did not need comfort, he needed speed. At 150 yards he saw it movement. A faint shift in the darkness of a spider hole, the briefest ripple of cloth. It was all Stein needed. He dropped to one knee, braced the Stinger, and squeezed the solenoid trigger. The Stinger unleashed a stream of fire so violent that volcanic rock disintegrated under the hail of bullets. The spider hole collapsed inward. The sniper's rifle, a Type 97 fitted with a telescopic sight, was thrown aside as the position disintegrated. When the ammunition belt ran dry, Stein advanced cautiously, his breath harsh in the thick, ash-laden air. The sniper was dead. Stein took the telescopic sight not as a trophy, but because any tool on the battlefield had value, and began running back toward Company A. The ridgeline no longer threatened him, but Stein knew that surviving the sniper's attack did not mean the island would forgive him for long. Iwo Jima had a way of punishing persistence. When he returned to Company A around 1300 hours, he found the situation worse than when he had left. The Marines had advanced, yes, but the Japanese had reorganized. Ahead of them lay a semicircle of 8 pillboxes connected by trenches and supported by underground tunnels. Each pillbox covered the others with overlapping fire. Any Marine who raised his head was met with bullets from multiple directions. The company commander was on the radio calling for tank support, but the M4 Shermans were still bogged down near the beach, their treads churning helplessly in the ash. Forward observers could not guide artillery. Air support could not hit targets hidden within volcanic rock. Company A was pinned again. Stein stepped into the forwardmost position, staring at the arc of pillboxes. The enemy had built an elegant, interdependent defensive system, but every system had weaknesses, and Stein still had the stinger. He knew exactly what to do. He stood up. No orders were needed. No shouted instructions. The Marines saw him rise, and many felt their breath catch. They knew what standing meant on Iwo Jima. It meant becoming a silhouette. It meant daring the machine gun crews to fire first. It meant stepping into the realm where only mathematics and instinct could decide who lived. Stein lifted the stinger, aimed at the leftmost pillbox, and fired a 5-second burst. The position went silent. Immediately he shifted to the next pillbox. Another burst. Silence. Ash flew into the air, concrete chipped away, defenders dropped back into their tunnels. Behind him, Marines recognized the rhythm fire equals movement. When the stinger roared, they advanced 50 yards. Stein dropped flat to reload. When he rose again and resumed firing, the Marines surged another 50 yards. No orders were necessary because the coordination felt natural, instinctive, a kind of battlefield symphony in which Stein's stinger set the percussion and the riflemen followed in perfect time. By 13:30 they had broken through the defensive arc. 5 pillboxes were destroyed. The remaining 3 were abandoned by their defenders, who retreated into deeper tunnels. Company A had taken 3 more casualties, but they were advancing again. The stinger, however, was approaching its limit. The barrel was slightly bent from an earlier bullet strike. The bipod had snapped off completely. The Garand stock was charred almost black. The solenoid trigger now fired in erratic bursts, 3 to 5 rounds instead of the seamless stream Stein needed. But somehow impossibly it still worked. Then, at 13:45, it happened. During the assault on the 6th pillbox, a Japanese Type 96 machine gun fired a burst that struck the stinger full force. The impact ripped the weapon from Stein's hands and sent it tumbling 6 feet backward into the volcanic ash. The blow was so violent it nearly tore the improvised gun apart. In an instant, Stein was unarmed. Japanese soldiers inside the pillbox saw the stinger fall. They understood the significance. They stopped firing, waiting for Stein to make the next move. They knew he would try to retrieve it. Stein stared at the twisted weapon lying in the open. He had carried it on 8 runs to the beach. He had used it to destroy more than a dozen enemy positions. It had saved dozens of Marines from certain death. He sprinted. Bullets erupted from the pillbox. Stein zigzagged across the ash, weaving through the hail of fire, his bare feet bleeding as sharp fragments sliced into them. He hurled himself onto the stinger, grabbing it against his chest, and rolled behind a low ridge of volcanic rock. The weapon was damaged. The belt feed mechanism was bent. The guide rails were twisted. Stein tore out the jammed belt with his bare hands, feeling the hot metal scorch his palms. He forced a fresh belt into place, tapped the solenoid trigger, and heard the internal components finally seat. He squeezed. The stinger fired. It was weaker, maybe 900 rounds per minute, but it fired. Stein rose again, walked directly toward the pillbox that had nearly killed him, and unleashed a full box of ammunition in 7 seconds. The position collapsed under the avalanche of fire. The machine gun that had torn the stinger from his hands fell silent forever. By 1400, Company A had advanced more than 400 yards. Stein had personally destroyed 12 enemy positions. He had saved 9 wounded Marines. He had fired more than 2,000 rounds, and the Stinger was barely held together, bent barrel, cracked stock, limping trigger-warped receiver. But the battlefield was not finished with him. Not yet. Ahead waited the slope of Mount Suribachi, the volcanic summit that controlled the entire southern end of the island, and Company A was about to climb it. Stein, bleeding from his feet and wounded by shrapnel, lifted the Stinger again. The mountain was waiting. By the time Company A reached the base of Mount Suribachi, the landscape around Stein looked less like a battlefield and more like a vision from another world. Black slopes of volcanic ash rising sharply into a jagged peak that loomed over the entire southern tip of Iwo Jima. The mountain was not simply high ground, it was a fortress. From its summit, Japanese spotters could see every move made on the beach, every attempt at reinforcement, every exposed gesture on the open slopes. Artillery observers used its vantage point to call down barrages with terrifying accuracy. And now, after 400 yards of brutal fighting, Company A had been ordered to hold a defensive perimeter at its foot until the next morning when the climb would begin. Stein felt the full weight of the day settling into his bones. His feet, bare and bloody from hours of sprinting across razor-like ash, throbbed with every movement. Volcanic grit had embedded itself into dozens of cuts, turning each wound into a gritty burn. Shrapnel fragments lodged in his left calf, and lower back pulsed with a dull ache. His hands were blistered from gripping the overheated Stinger, and his uniform was so caked with blood, sweat, and ash that it felt like a weighted cloak dragging behind him. He lowered himself into a shallow fighting hole and laid the Stinger beside him. The weapon looked as battered as he felt. The barrel, once straight and precise, now bent at a noticeable angle about 5 degrees. The stock was so charred that the wood flaked under the touch, blackened like burnt driftwood. The solenoid trigger, once a clever adaptation crafted from sheet metal in a Hawaiian workshop, now clicked unpredictably. Sometimes it fired a single round, sometimes a short burst, sometimes nothing. Stein had to manually cycle the action between bursts to coax the weapon into functioning at all. Yet, despite the damage, despite the impossibility of what it had been asked to do, the Stinger still represented something essential. It was the piece of himself he had carved into metal, his stubbornness, his precision, his refusal to let any obstacle stand unchallenged. As he sat under the fading light, listening to the distant rumble of artillery bouncing off the mountain's slopes, Stein felt no pride, no triumph, only a sense of obligation. The arithmetic had not changed. Company A still needed a weapon that could suppress multiple positions, and if the Stinger still fired even a handful of rounds, then it still served its purpose. The night did not offer rest. Japanese infiltrators moved through the darkness like shadows slipping between folds of volcanic rock. They came in pairs and trios, testing the edges of Company A's perimeter, searching for weak points. Some crawled. Some walked deliberately, using the terrain as a shield. Some whispered to one another, coordinating as they probed for a way to slip behind the Marines and attack from within. Stein held the Stinger across his knees, listening, a faint scrape of ash, a silhouette shifting 30 yards in front of his position. Stein lifted the battered machine gun, braced the warped stock against his shoulder, and squeezed the trigger. A burst of fire, ragged, uneven, but still deadly, spat from the Stinger. The infiltrator stumbled forward and fell. Stein exhaled slowly. One more threat extinguished. One more moment the perimeter held. But every time he squeezed the trigger, he could feel the weapon deteriorating further. The rate of fire continued to drop. Internal components dragged against each other with uneasy friction. The barrel glowed faintly even in the cool night air. Still, Stein remained awake. Through the long hours until dawn, he fought exhaustion as fiercely as he had fought the pillboxes. He had been in continuous combat for 8 hours. He had run nearly 3 miles in volcanic ash while carrying wounded men and ammunition. He had survived sniper fire, shrapnel blasts, and machine gun bursts that had torn the Stinger from his hands twice. But at dawn, the mountain awaited. At 0800 hours on February 20th, Company A, along with the rest of the 28th Marines, began climbing the southern flank of Mount Suribachi. The terrain was brutal beyond expectation. The volcanic ash was so loose that each step forward sank half a foot downward. The slopes funneled Marines into exposed ridges where Japanese observers could track every movement, and the defenders had prepared more than 60 pillboxes, bunkers and cave positions across the mountain, each one linked to another by tunnels. Stein carried the Stinger as best he could. An armourer had tried to repair it during the night, replacing the worst damaged components, adjusting the solenoid trigger, and reinstalling a functioning belt feed mechanism. But even with new parts, the barrel was still bent. The accuracy was compromised. The recoil had shifted unpredictably. Yet at close range, none of that mattered. The Stinger still delivered volume, and volume was what mattered. Midway up the mountain, Company A encountered a reinforced bunker complex. 4 concrete bunkers connected by trenches carved into the volcanic rock formed a defensive knot that slowed the Marines to a crawl. Machine gun positions inside the bunkers fired in sweeping arcs, while mortar teams in hidden pits rained explosives into the exposed approaches. The advance stalled. Stein stepped forward. He identified the bunker with the highest output of fire, braced the Stinger, and unleashed a ragged burst. The bullets tore through the bunker's slit openings, suppressing the defenders long enough for a demolition team to creep forward with satchel charges. The bunker blew apart with a hollow, concussive thud. Company A surged 20, then 50 yards up the slope. Then fate intervened. At 10:15, a Japanese grenade landed 3 feet from where Stein stood. He saw it, a small, rounded silhouette tumbling across the ash. He moved, but not fast enough. The grenade detonated in a violent flash, showering his right arm, right leg and torso with shrapnel. He collapsed to one knee, blood staining the ash beneath him. Corpsmen reached him within minutes, binding the wounds and urging him to evacuate. But Stein refused. The Stinger, no matter how damaged, was still needed, and as long as it could fire, he would fire it. For 2 more hours, bleeding through his bandages, he continued suppressing pillboxes and trench systems, delivering bursts whenever Japanese defenders appeared. His vision blurred. His legs trembled. His breath grew shallow. At 12:30, his blood loss became unmistakable. The edges of his vision darkened. Voices around him began to sound distant, muffled as if underwater. A corpsman leaned close and said words Stein could no longer ignore. "If we do not evacuate you now, you will die on this mountain." Stein nodded, finally accepting what his body had known before his mind did. He handed the Stinger to another Marine, a young man who looked at the weapon with equal parts fear and reverence, and allowed the corpsman to drag him back down the slope toward the beach. From there, he was transported to a hospital ship anchored offshore. As surgeons removed shrapnel from his limbs and treated him for blood loss, the assault on Mount Suribachi continued without him. The 28th Marines fought through caves, bunkers, and spider holes. Many Marines fell. Many more pressed on. On February 23rd, a small patrol reached the summit and raised a flag, the first American flag atop Mount Suribachi. Later that day, a larger flag was raised. Both moments were captured by the lens of photographer Joe Rosenthal, producing the image that would become the most iconic photograph of the Pacific War. But Stein was not there. He lay in a hospital bed, recovering, unaware that the world was about to embed the image of 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman into its collective memory forever. He also did not yet know that he would soon face a new choice, one that would pull him back into the fight against every order, every medical directive, and every instinct for self-preservation, because the battle for Iwo Jima was far from over, and Stein's story was not yet finished. Stein awoke on the hospital ship to the distant thrum of engines and the muted thunder of artillery drifting across the sea. His wounds had been cleaned, the shrapnel removed, and bandages wrapped tightly around his arm, leg, and torso. Doctors told him that he would soon be evacuated to a rear hospital in Hawaii, perhaps even returned to the United States. His war, they said, was over. But even as they spoke, Stein could sense that something was wrong. Something felt unfinished. He had left the battlefield not because he chose to, but because his body had collapsed. And now, lying in a sterile bed surrounded by white sheets, he felt caged, detached. He imagined the volcanic ash beneath his feet. He imagined the faces of the Marines he had carried bleeding and broken across the killing ground. And he imagined the Stinger, the weapon he had built with his own hands, continuing the fight with someone else at its trigger. He felt uneasily still. On February 25th, news reached the hospital ship that cut deeper than any shrapnel. The 5th Marine Division had moved north from Suribachi and was now engaged in brutal combat at Hill 362A, a jagged, nightmarish rise of volcanic ground that resisted every advance. Casualties were catastrophic. Company A, Stein's company, had lost nearly 1/3 of its strength in just 2 days. His platoon sergeant was dead. His squad leader was dead. Marines he had lived with, trained with, bled with, men he had carried ammunition for, and who had covered him during the assault, were dying on a nameless hill in the center of Iwo Jima. Stein could not stay away. On the morning of February 26th, against explicit medical orders, Stein rose from his bed, dressed himself slowly, wincing as fresh bandages pulled against his skin, and made his way to the edge of the hospital ship. He found a landing craft preparing to return to the beach and told the boat crew that he had been cleared to return to duty. It was a lie. But no one questioned the young corporal with the haunted eyes and the bandaged limbs. They loaded him aboard. As the landing craft churned toward shore, Stein stared silently at the dark outline of Iwo Jima rising ahead. He could smell the battlefield in his memory, the smoke, the ash, the sickly metallic scent of blood, and with each passing second he felt like he was stepping back into who he truly was. He landed around 1400 hours and immediately sought out a supply sergeant. Despite the bandages wrapping both feet, Stein took a new pair of boots. He would need them. He grabbed an M1 Garand rifle from a supply crate. The Stinger was gone, either destroyed under the relentless fire of the battle or carried by another Marine. Stein did not ask. He did not need to. What he needed was a weapon, and he needed to reach his company. He began the walk north, 6 miles through volcanic ash heat and the wreckage of war. He passed burned-out tanks, shattered equipment, and the destroyed remnants of countless Japanese positions. The bodies of Marines covered respectfully by graves registration teams lay lined along parts of the path. Stein walked past them in silence. Each one reminded him why he had returned. Each one spoke a language he understood too well, the language of unfinished duty. By the time he reached Company A's position on Hill 362A on February 27th, the company had been reduced from about 240 men to just 63 exhausted survivors. Their faces were hollow. Their uniforms were shredded. They had been engaged in continuous combat for 8 days with no meaningful rest, facing an enemy that fought with the ferocity of men determined to die rather than surrender. Stein approached the company commander. There was no dramatic welcome, no shouts of surprise, only a weary nod. Command needed every rifle they could get. Stein was handed ammunition and returned to the line as if he had never left. For 2 days he fought alongside the remnants of Company A. Without the Stinger, the fighting felt different, slower, more deliberate, more intimate. He carried an M1 Garand, now a reliable rifle, but incapable of delivering the overwhelming fire that had defined his earlier actions. Still, Stein fought with the same calm precision and relentless determination. Where the line faltered, he stepped in. Where a bunker spat fire, he moved closer. Where grenades bounced down trench walls, he pushed forward. Then came March 1st. Company A was ordered to send a reconnaissance patrol to locate a complex of Japanese pillboxes that were blocking the regiment's advance. The patrol consisted of 19 Marines. Stein was designated the assistant patrol leader. Their task was simple in concept but lethal in execution: move approximately 400 yards ahead, identify the enemy positions, and return with information. They were not to engage unless necessary. At 0700 hours, the patrol moved out. The terrain was unforgiving: volcanic ridges, shallow ravines, and jagged outcroppings that provided perfect hiding places for Japanese defenders. The patrol's progress was slow and methodical. 20 yards. Stop. Listen. Observe. 20 more yards. Repeat. Stein moved near the front, scanning constantly, his senses sharpened by experience and intuition. He knew this kind of ground. He knew how the Japanese positioned their snipers. He knew the kind of silence that preceded an ambush. At 0745, the patrol reached a ridgeline overlooking a small valley. Through the shifting haze of ash and sunlight, Stein saw what appeared to be camouflaged openings, possible cave entrances, possibly pillboxes. They needed to move closer to confirm. He signaled the patrol. They stepped forward. Stein's feet, still bandaged beneath the new boots, ached with each step. His shrapnel wounds still throbbed, but he kept going. Because that was the equation, that was the duty, that was the logic he lived by. At 07:52, a single rifle shot cracked through the morning air. The bullet struck Stein in the head. He collapsed instantly. The Marines behind him shouted, diving for cover, returning fire toward the suspected direction of the sniper. A corpsman reached Stein within seconds, but there was nothing to be done. The shot had been fatal. The sniper, hidden in a spider hole nearly 200 yards away, had been waiting for a perfect moment. He found it. Stein died at 07:53 on March 1, 1945, on a patch of black volcanic ash that had already absorbed the blood of thousands. The patrol, though stunned, completed its mission. They identified the pillbox complex and returned to Company A with the information. But they also carried Stein's body back with them. News of his death travelled quickly through the 28th Marines. The barefoot corporal, the man who had made 8 trips across the killing ground under fire, rescued 9 wounded Marines, destroyed enemy positions with a weapon he had built himself, refused evacuation when wounded and returned illegally. From a hospital ship, was gone. There was no battlefield ceremony. There was only grief, silence, and the grim continuation of a battle that would rage for weeks more. But Stein's story was not over, not even close, because the weight of his actions, every sprint across volcanic ash, every rescued Marine, every burst of fire from the Stinger would echo far beyond Iwo Jima. It would inspire the living shape, the memory of the Corps, and ultimately lead to the highest recognition any American service member can receive. The morning after Stein fell, the battle for Iwo Jima continued with merciless intensity. Waves of Marines pushed northward through a landscape of shattered bunkers, scorched tunnels, and stubborn defenders who seemed to materialize from the earth itself. The fight lasted another 24 days. Nearly 7,000 Americans died. More than 20,000 were wounded, and of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 1,000 survived. In that place of volcanic ash and fire, where courage and loss were measured in inches rather than miles, the barefoot corporal from Dayton left behind a legacy carved deeper than any crater on the island. A simple cross, a profound loss. On March 2nd, Corporal Tony Stein was buried in the 5th Division Cemetery on Iwo Jima. A simple wooden cross marked the grave, his rank, his unit, his service number. Nothing more. No mention of the Stinger, no mention of the men he had saved, no mention of the Medal of Honor that would later bear his name. To those who placed the cross, the simplicity felt fitting. Stein had never sought recognition. He never boasted about the weapon he built or the decisions he made. He viewed each action through the clarity of purpose that had guided him across the beach, an unspoken arithmetic of survival, duty, and precision. But history would not let the story end quietly. The aftermath of heroism. In the weeks following the island's capture, officers of the 28th Marines compiled after-action reports detailing the events of February 19th. They documented every run Stein made, every wounded Marine he carried, every enemy position he suppressed or destroyed, every impossible decision he transformed into decisive action. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, who commanded the 2nd Battalion of the 28th Marines, read the reports with a growing sense of awe. He drafted a recommendation for the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. His recommendation described Stein's actions in clear, unembellished terms: 8 trips under fire, 9 wounded Marines evacuated, multiple enemy fortifications destroyed, repeated acts of valor performed while injured barefoot and under relentless fire. The recommendation traveled up the chain of Command Regiment Division Fleet Marine Force Pacific Command. Every officer endorsed it. There was no debate. Stein's actions exceeded the call of duty by any conceivable measure. The Medal of Honor. On February 19, 1946, exactly 1 year after his extraordinary stand on Iwo Jima, Stein's widow, Joan stood inside the Ohio State House. She was a young woman overwhelmed by the sudden shift from private grief to public ceremony, from the quiet memory of a husband to the weight of a nation's recognition. Ohio Governor Frank Lausch placed the Medal of Honor in her hands. Stein's mother, Rose, stood beside her, tears streaming silently down her face. She had fled Eastern Europe to escape persecution, raised her son in Dayton, and taught him the values of hard work and courage. Now she watched as he became the only Medal of Honor recipient from Dayton in the Second World War. The citation read in part, "The first man of his unit to be on station after hitting the beach in the initial assault, Corporal Stein, armed with a personally improvised aircraft-type weapon, provided rapid covering fire as the remainder of his platoon attempted to move into position." It continued for 3 more paragraphs chronicling his fearless charges, his calculated exposure to enemy fire, and the 20 Japanese soldiers he personally killed during a single-handed assault. The citation did not use the name Stinger, but every Marine who had fought beside him remembered it. Combing home. Stein's remains stayed on Iwo Jima until 1948. That December, his body was returned to Dayton with full military honors. The ceremony at Our Lady of the Rosary Church drew hundreds of veterans, families, and civilians who had never known him but understood instinctively what he represented. He was buried in Calvary Cemetery. His grave marker bore his name, rank, unit, and decoration. Visitors began leaving coins, small American flags, and personal tributes. Over the years, countless strangers paused at the grave, reading the name and recalling a story that was too extraordinary to fade. The USS Stein. In 1972, the United States Navy commissioned a Knox-class frigate in his honor, USS Stein. The ship served for 21 years, participating in operations in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Wherever the frigate sailed, it carried Stein's name with it, a reminder of one Marine's impossible courage and ingenuity. The ship was decommissioned in 1993 and eventually scrapped, but its service ensured that Tony Stein's legacy lived not only in memory but on the open sea. The Stinger's place in history. None of the 6 original Stingers survived the war. They were field modifications, non-standard weapons, destined to be scrapped once their usefulness ended. But their legend endured. Armorers and firearms historians spoke of them in reverent tones of how a toolmaker from Dayton had salvaged an aircraft machine gun from a wrecked Dauntless dive bomber and transformed it into a ground weapon capable of altering the course of a company-level battle. Decades later, Ian McCollum of Forgotten Weapons documented the Stinger's history, and the Canadian Historical Arms Museum built a functional replica to test its capabilities. Their conclusion echoed what the Marines on Iwo Jima already knew. Stein and Sergeant Mel Grevich had created something extraordinary. A weapon born of necessity. A weapon forged from ingenuity. A weapon that gave a single man the power to change the battlefield. The Marine Corps remembers. At Paris Island, the legendary recruit depot where new Marines learn what it means to earn the title, Stein's story became part of the curriculum. Instructors taught recruits about improvisation, adaptation, and the fierce determination that defines the Marine ethos. They spoke of a toolmaker who built a weapon in a maintenance shed, of a corporal who ran barefoot through volcanic ash, of a Marine who carried 9 wounded men across 200 yards of open ground, of a young man who refused evacuation when wounded and returned to the fight when he should have been on a hospital ship, of courage that transcended fear, pain, and reason, of improvise, adapt, overcome the unspoken creed Stein embodied with every step. His final measure. Military historians debate whether the Stinger had a significant tactical impact on the battle as a whole. Some argue that 6 improvised weapons could not alter the fate of an island defended by 17,000 soldiers. Others argue that at key moments during the first critical hours of February 19th, Stein's Stinger changed everything for the Marines of Company A. But there is one point that no historian disputes. Courage cannot be measured in numbers alone. Stein was 23 years old when he died. He had been a Marine for 2 years and 5 months. He fought on 2 islands, Bougainville and Iwo Jima. He killed more enemy soldiers than official records could accurately count. He saved 9 wounded Marines in a single day. And he did it all with a weapon he had built in a maintenance shed in Hawaii. His bravery was not impulsive, it was mathematical, deliberate, conscious. A choice repeated hundreds of times in the span of a single morning. The story lives on. And now, as we remember him through history books, museums, documentaries, and personal stories, we honor more than a single Marine. We honor every soldier who stood under fire, every toolmaker, mechanic, or craftsman who used their skill to protect others, Every young man and woman who faced a moment of impossible odds and chose to step forward anyway. Tony Stein was not a myth. He was not an archetype. He was a real man made of sweat, grit, blood skill, and an unwavering sense of duty. And his story, like the stinger he carried, continues to echo through time, reminding us of what ordinary people can achieve when pushed to the extreme edge of human endurance.